I'm tired of the politics on both sides.
I can't believe anything that they say.
We are not getting journalism. We are not serving
Washington
the public.
Washington works for anyone who can hire an army of lobbyists and lawyers.
The media bias, I guess, just depends on which channel you watch. I think that we need a different point of view.
Media has gone over the top.
They can't stand the truth, and apparently the news media can't stand the truth either.
Congressmen and senators have lots of power, and we know that power corrupts.
Special checks and the winks and nods run Washington.
In 1995, 20 years ago this spring, between my junior and senior year of high school, I found myself in an animal experimentation laboratory funded by tax dollars. And I saw up close and personal the horrific abuses that you really wouldn't want to wish on your worst enemy. You know, if this is one of the good labs, what the heck are they doing in the bad ones?
While he may sound like an animal rights activist, he's not. Anthony Bellotti considers himself a taxpayers' rights activist, and he says the government is wasting billions of dollars on inefficient and inhumane testing, all in the name of science.
If you were to ask me what the worst laboratory in the country is for animals right now, it's right here. It's right here. It's Congress. Why? They are spending the money on this that creates the market. 7 cents on the dollar before.
Bellotti is the founder of a nonprofit group called White Coat Waste Movement. Their goal is to cut taxpayer-funded animal testing, the vast majority of which is appropriated to the National Institutes of Health, or NIH.
47% of the NIH budget is going into this for $12 billion a year. That doesn't include EPA. That doesn't include USDA. Department of Defense, you name it. They're all doing it. The lion's share, though, is with the NIH.
Since 1995, Congress has nearly tripled the NIH budget. The agency doles out nearly $12 billion each year in the form of university grants for professors to conduct animal experimentation. While the NIH claims the testing is aimed at finding medical advances in humans, Bellotti says it's nothing more than wasteful spending.
We're talking about experiments that have been going on 20, 30, 40 years at taxpayer expense with nothing to show for it. We're talking about, for example, at the University of Minnesota, one college professor is taking federal tax dollars for the purposes of testing crack cocaine on menstruating monkeys. You heard that correctly. We're talking about addiction experiments that have cost taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars.
It's difficult to see how this translates into real benefits for people who suffer from addiction disorders, because there are so many factors that influence whether or not humans become addicted to drugs.
Dr. Hope Ferdosian is a physician specializing in preventative and internal medicine. She is also an assistant professor at George Washington University's medical school.
And there are so many ethical ways to study humans over time who have struggled with addiction that would be so much more beneficial to the humans themselves.
Are there any more examples that we can look at as far as universities doing these long-term experiments or these kind of extreme experiments on animals?
Oh, there sure are.
Now we'll take the baby monkey out and put in a wire mother.
Many people remember from their psychology class Harry Harlow, who infamously invented maternal deprivation experiments in which a baby monkey, right after birth, is forcibly removed from her mother. The baby, in turn, is placed in something like, their words not mine, called the pit of despair. Right now, at the University of Wisconsin, we are still doing this at taxpayer expense.
Basically, they're trying to show that it may have implications for children who suffer from mental health disorders. But this is rather ridiculous, because if we look at kids, the propensity for children to develop mental health disorders is influenced by so many different things. Development, genetics, that's where research efforts should focus, not on taking monkeys away from their mothers and their peers and exposing them to different drugs.
We're doing it not only outsourcing it to the University of Wisconsin at taxpayer expense, we are doing it also right here in the Beltway on the NIH campus itself. We are repeating these experiments. We're doing it on government campuses, and we're doing it to endless variations on a theme. And for what? What are we getting for our money here?
And monkeys aren't the only animals subjected to questionable experimentation in government-funded labs.
Dogs are commonly used in treadmill experiments, cardiovascular experiments, to try to understand the effects of different drugs or procedures on the heart rate.
For nearly a generation, we have been forcing at taxpayer expense beagles and other dogs to run on treadmills until they have heart attacks. Again, common sense issues that we have to question, is this really the budget priority? And we've spent between $5 and $8 million on that experiment, and it's still going on and on.
It's hard to know what any of that means for, to us for human heart disease. We know a lot about the human heart, and dogs don't develop cardiovascular disease in the same way that humans do.
According to NIH documents, the agency granted nearly $3.8 million to Professor George Billman at Ohio State University to conduct exercise experiments with beagles from 1990 until 2010. Similar studies are also still being funded at Wayne State University in Detroit, totaling more than $6 million to date.
If you want to get these beagles off the treadmills, if you want to get the crack out of the monkeys, the only way you're going to do it is to derail the gravy train. Clean up the spending, because when the tax dollars are gone, the animal abusers are gone.
After meeting with Anthony Bellotti, our team continued to research the ethics and efficacy of government-funded animal testing. The next day, we scheduled an interview with someone on the other side of the issue.
My name is Matt Bailey. I'm Executive Vice President for the National Association for Biomedical Research.
The NABR is a nonprofit group that lobbies public officials in support of animal testing in biomedical research.
What sort of advances have we seen or can we attribute to government-funded biomedical research?
Well, look, if you've ever taken insulin, if you've been the recipient of a pacemaker or a blood transfusion or an organ transplant, you have benefited from the use of animals in research.
What would you say to people who think it's unethical to test on animals? And what about their tax dollars being used to fund the NIH or NIDA or any of these other?
Well, for people who think it's unethical, I'd ask them to consider the alternative. Would they rather us test new treatments and drugs on children, the mentally ill, prisoners? Those things have all been tried throughout history, and they did not work out that well. I have a daughter, and I, for one, am grateful that new drugs, new treatments are tested in an animal model before they go to humans. In addition, the FDA requires it. For a drug company, you have to show efficacy of your treatment within 2 different species before you can move to human clinical trials.
The problem is that the data is very difficult to interpret and apply to humans. Sometimes it happens to apply and sometimes it happens to be wrong. And so that overall, has the animal model system been an effective or wise choice, approach to medicine? I think it's very unclear.
Dr. Stephen Kaufman is an ophthalmologist and an assistant professor at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio.
The problem with using animal models is that they are essentially analogies. They're not the same thing. They're different animals, obviously, with different organs, different physiology. The medications we give to them enter their bodies in different ways, in different concentrations, and they're distributed and metabolized, that is broken down differently.
As a doctor, I never use data from animal experiments or animal studies to guide my clinical decisions about humans. There are different levels of evidence, and animal experiments are at the very bottom.
I think that private industry is the proper avenue for this kind of research. If it really is valuable, there are people who will want to invest in it because that's going to be a useful investment. If it really is valuable, there's a lot of money to be made in medicine if you come up with things that have clinical value.
Dr. Coleman, thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate your time.
In an effort to learn more about the private sector's role, we set up a Skype interview with Dr. John Coleman. For 30 years, Coleman worked for the British pharmaceutical giant GlaxoSmithKline, developing drugs using both animal and non-animal testing methods.
One had to choose your animal model very carefully to get the results that you wanted. And still there was no guarantee that once you got the results that you wanted, they were going to be relevant to clinical use, potential clinical use of these compounds, either in terms of their efficacy or indeed in terms of safety.
Was there a particular turning point for you, Dr. Coleman, where you came to the realization that you did no longer need animals for experimentation, that you would solely rely on human tissue?
I think it was just a growing concern. Testing a particular new drug in a rat gave a different result from that in a guinea pig, gave a different result from that in a dog. So which one was going to be relevant to human? And it occurred to me that potentially none of them. So it's just a growing realization of the shortcomings of animals in telling you what you don't know. And what's the point of doing an experiment but to get information on things you don't know?
Private industry tends to bring a product to the marketplace that people can consume on a broad scale, but they don't necessarily have the ability to answer the very basic fundamental questions that need to be asked. That's where government-funded research projects come into play.
The problem is, even the government itself, the FDA itself admits that 92% of successful breakthroughs for treatments in drugs in animals fail. 92% fail in humans once successfully passing animal models. Why is it that we're doubling down literally and subsidizing stuff with a 92% failure rate?
Why do you think the United States government then is so vested in animal testing?
It's an industry. There are people making money off of animal experimentation. Academic institutions, lobbyists. It's an industry.
How long do you think, Dr. Coleman, before we reach a point where animal testing will be diminished?
I think it will start diminishing soon, to be honest. This particular system just cannot keep going at this rate. The failure rates are far too high, the expenses are far too high. Something has got to happen. Common sense has got to prevail, and we've got to see that we've got to focus more on appropriate biology rather than inappropriate biology.
Do you think that the average American is aware of how much money that the government is spending on actual animal testing?
No, but they darn well should be.
Congressman Tom Marino represents Pennsylvania's 10th district. Marino says he's worried that too many government-funded animal experiments are inhumane and ineffective.
First of all, any experiments using animals have to be humane, and if it's not, we have to stop it and then hold those accountable for not following the rules. The ends does not justify the means, and we have to make sure that labs are not continuing doing repetitive work or just collecting these grants so they can say we're doing research. And there has to be an objective, there has to be results, and it has to be within a reasonable period of time.
But supporters of animal testing say there is already too much oversight, which they claim is hindering medical advancements.
I think a lot of people don't realize that in total, there are actually more regulations in place for conducting animal research than there are for human clinical trials. The Animal Welfare Act stipulates that each institution has to have an institutional animal care and use committee, which is a very diverse committee made up of research scientists, veterinarians, vet techs, outside community members.
95% of animals aren't even covered by the Animal Welfare Act because they don't meet the definition of animal. So a lot of animals are excluded. For animals who are covered by the Animal Welfare Act, there's still no threshold for what can be done to them. Monkeys, for example, can suffer for years on end in laboratories in solitary confinement, and there's no prohibition against that as long as the research protocol gets through an institutional animal care and use committee.
The animal care and use committees are primarily staffed by members of the medical school or other research institution, so I have very little faith that they have significant oversight of the research that's done. What they tend to do is just make sure that the housing and the caging and things like that are appropriate. Rarely, if ever, do they ascertain whether or not the research is valuable, whether the benefits are worth the price being paid to the animals or to society.
I have a great deal of respect for NIH, but we do need more oversight. And I've come to learn that a lot of that oversight is really not done by NIH. It's the institute that's performing the experiment. Who is checking on the institution that's doing the experimenting, but also certifying that we are following the rules?
The government's animal care committees are a key component of the Animal Welfare Act. But getting records of their oversight isn't always easy. The Animal Legal Defense Fund has filed at least 3 lawsuits since 2012 against universities that are failing to comply with public records laws. One of the suits against UCLA involves an experiment that forcibly addicts monkeys to methamphetamine.
The problem with the Animal Welfare Act is that it's emblematic of a larger system that's broken. If it worked, if it was providing critical oversight, how did we end up with all these 30 and 40-year grants of crack-smoking monkeys? How did we end up with a $1 billion budget for the National Institute of Drug Abuse? How did we end up with 20 years of forcing beagles to run on treadmill at taxpayer expense? Clearly, anyone with common sense can see the system is not working.
Well, I think it's not always immediately clear to the public what some of the fundamental questions are. The public, and in some cases I include myself in this, are not incredibly scientifically literate. So they may see something that looks disconcerting, but not understand the potential end results and the importance that may represent to the overall scientific knowledge base.
But that belief runs counter to what the former head of the NIH publicly stated 2 years ago. In June 2013, the agency's former director, Elias Zerhouni, criticized the agency's over-reliance on animal testing, saying, "The problem is that it hasn't worked, and it's time we stopped dancing around the problem. We need to refocus and adapt new methodologies for use in humans to understand disease biology in humans."
I see it in my own field where a great deal of research is done on animal models, and I read these articles and I'm saying, how do I apply that to my clinical patients? And I can't really see an applicability because I don't trust that the data from the animals is going to apply to human beings.
I'm a 3-time cancer survivor. I have a half of one kidney. My daughter has cystic fibrosis. So, I have a real vested interest in this to see how this money's being spent, to make sure that we're getting the bang for our buck, and to make sure that these animals are treated humanely.
On March 19, 2015, Marino sent a letter expressing his concerns to Congressman Tom Cole. Cole is the chairman of the House Appropriations Subcommittee responsible for NIH funding. Marino asked Cole's committee to re-examine its oversight role to ensure appropriate use of taxpayer funds.
We need to go through regular order and appropriate. I want to be looking at NIH, and I want to be looking at Health and Human Services in other areas on a line-by-line basis, and we should be making House members, both Republican and Democrats, and senators, both Republican and Democrat, make the tough vote and let their constituents see where they are on these issues.
Both Representative Cole and the NIH declined to provide an interview for this story. Through a spokesperson, the NIH did send us a statement that reads in part, NIH and NIH-funded researchers are hard at work developing alternatives to animal models. Until these technologies mature or develop, all research projects are carefully evaluated to determine if any method could be effectively used in place of animals. If no other option exists, researchers determine the minimum number of animals required to do the research.
I think the most important thing is that we don't inadvertently, whether it's through an effort to save tax dollars or an effort to be socially conscious, that we don't inadvertently handcuff research. We need to allow science to pursue science the best way possible.
Have the animal models been helpful is really the question. And in many of these cases, I'd say, as best I can tell, the answer is no. And have they been necessary? About that, I'm more convinced the answer is no, because I think that if animals are not available, people find other ways to do the research, ways that are available to us right now.
If you cut spending that hurts animals, you can save tax dollars and dogs, cats, primates, and all these abused animals in the system. It's a supply-side strategy. We need to choke the source of the problem, wasteful spending.